This week on Quality Digest Live, we'll chat with Richard Raziel of TÜV America about effective complaint management.
Plus, a brief history of faulty experimentation. That and more when we come back.
Welcome back to Quality Digest Live for May 15th, 2015. QDL is your weekly look at who and what is making the news in the world of quality. I'm Mike Richmond, publisher of Quality Digest.
And I'm Quality Digest Editor-in-Chief, Dirk Ducharme. So if you're in the automotive industry or an automotive supplier, this story is for you. The Automotive Industry Action Group, the AIAG, has announced the release of a comprehensive collection of tools and training to help auto companies conduct business in an ethical and responsible way, a way that benefits workers, communities, and the environment, of course. So the tools and the training are the outcome of the Automotive Industry Guiding Principles to Enhance Sustainability in the Supply Chain document.
Yeah.
Could have done a shorter name than that. But if you're in the auto industry, you're familiar with that document. That's right. And that was released to the industry about last year. So some of you may be familiar with that. It was endorsed by 14 automakers, including GM, Ford, Daimler, Fiat Chrysler, Toyota, Honda, Volvo, and the others. And it specifically outlines the industry's expected standards in business integrity, and we think this is important, and this is the key, the social and environmental performance of its supply chain. And of course, the document focuses on ethics and environmental standards and human rights and working conditions. All stuff that has been in the news over the past few years. It's, really no longer enough that a company simply keeps business practices above board and keeps kind of their business end of things up to snuff. Shareholders and consumers in general want to know that an industry is thinking globally in terms of workers and sustainability and the environment. That's why we've seen so much of that in the news over the last few years. According to Tanya Bolden, AIG's corporate responsibility program, the tools are designed to help suppliers assess their readiness for meeting those principles. The AIG Supply Chain Sustainability Guidelines, assessment tools, education, training, and other collateral materials are designed for companies of all sizes, and the AIG is strongly encouraging suppliers to start with the supply chain sustainability e-learning and knowledge assessments. This is going to provide you a baseline of understanding and help show you where your enterprise and its team members, where they might need more education and training. So it's a good place to start. So if you're a part of the automotive supply chain and want more information, you can get more by following the story link below the player page, and that'll take you out to the story, and from there you can link out to various aspects of the AIG site as well as those particular documents. So
yeah, very, very good tools there.
Good stuff, yep.
Very valuable for those in the automotive supply chain. Alrighty, well, this Monday in Quality Digest Daily, this past Monday, we ran a very interesting piece, I think, from TÜV titled The Changing Role of the Quality Management Representative. And it looked at some of the adjustments that organizations are going to have to be making to comply with the rapidly approaching release of ISO 9001:2015.
Just a few months.
Just a few months, coming right up now. The 2008 version of ISO 9001 required the appointment of a designated quality management representative known as the QMR. And this was someone from the management team whose job it was to coordinate the development and implementation of the quality management system within the organization. And this person generally also served as the interface, the one who dealt as the point of contact for the auditor when that happened, when auditors came in. The draft version of ISO 9001:2015, however, changes this scenario a little bit, and the new version of the standard is actually getting rid of the dedicated QMR role. However, the QMR function isn't going anywhere at all. In fact, the intention of the standard is to see this function grow in importance. Instead of a single dedicated person who's going to act as the designated management representative, top management now in general is going to be expected to take on the ownership of the QMS, the effectiveness of the QMS. So they can't just provide resources for the QMS within their organization. They must ensure that it's implemented as intended throughout the organization. It's intended to not allow management to pass the buck saying, okay, you're the guy or the gal who's going to deal with this, and the rest of us cannot have to deal with it anymore. No.
Right.
All of us in the management team have to understand how quality affects the organization. Now, This, of course, as many know, is one of the several significant changes to ISO 9001 that's coming out of this new version of the standard. Others include the abdication of the need for a quality manual, a fuller explanation of what the context of the organization means, and the advent of risk-based thinking, among some other things. So what all these changes have in common is the understanding that the pursuit of quality and the performance excellence within an organization must come from the wellspring of that organization's culture and strategy, not its tools and tactics, right? I mean, quality as a discrete silo within companies is on its way out, and it's really been on its way out for quite some time. Yeah, all of these changes reflect a more complete perspective of quality tied into planning, customer fulfillment, risk, and the other higher level functions of the organization. So it really, ISO 9001, the intent, the framers of the standard is to get it away from being very tactical and tool-based and to become more strategic at the upper reaches of the organization.
And it's interesting, you mentioned these two things. You mentioned the quality management representative and the quality manual.
Yeah.
Those two things are kind of sticking points for a lot of people. And actually upsetting to some people. Some people really think that, well, if there isn't one person, a quality management representative who's kind of like overseeing it or whatever, and no quality manual, well, you need a quality manual. And I think some of those people are missing the point that the idea behind these aren't going away. They're being implemented, that function or the importance of those is being taken up in a different fashion. So rather than having a quality manual, your documentation in total, those pieces go in to cover those things that you might normally have covered in a quality. And a lot of people are saying, go ahead and keep a quality manual. It's a useful tool.
Yeah, why not?
It's a useful tool. Why not have it? Yeah. And the quality management representative, like you said, it's more important that everybody be responsible rather than some dude who's going to say, be doing this or
well,
whatever.
That's what happens. I mean, that's how management works in many cases in American companies, is they say, you got it, you're responsible for it, now none of the rest of us have to worry about it anymore, because that one person is going to report out every month or every week, whatever it is, and we kind of wash our hands of it. That's not what ISO is supposed to be about. It's not what ISO 9001 is supposed to be about in these organizations. That's why they're making that change, I think.
Okay. Yeah. Well, interesting enough, this is actually just a coincidence, but we actually have another story that came from TÜV Süd. Actually, our guest is from TÜV Süd. And it's interesting. It's an interesting tie-in. We talk about the changes in ISO 9001 and how, in a sense, it is looking at the company more holistically. When we talk about, let's say, the voice of the customer, very often we think of the voice of the customer in terms of ideas or suggestions for improving their product or your product, and very often that voice is not a suggestion for improvement, the voice is a complaint. Mm-hmm. And I would argue, as will our next guest, that complaints are probably the most important and useful voice of the customer you can get. So how you collect and address complaints is extremely important for a company. And by the way, I would say that in a sense, how you do that also ties in to your ISO 9001, how you implement it, corrective and preventive action, how you're collecting that voice of the customer in terms of complaints and so forth, and then what you're doing with it. So these things are very synergistic. Well, our guest today is Richard Raziel, Vice President, Medical Health Services for TÜV Süd, America's TÜV Süd. He has led global quality, regulatory, clinical, and government affairs for organizations like Abbott, Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, and Covidien. And prior to that, Raziel spent 10 years in FDA's headquarters in Washington. So I guess you could say he is an expert on this topic. Hi, Richard. How are you this morning?
I'm just great, guys. Thanks. Great to be with you again.
Okay. Well, you have drawn, in discussions you and I have had, you have drawn the distinction between, let's say, focus groups, which tend to be kind of feel-good sessions where, you're talking to customers, trying to find out, what enhancements they want or that sort of thing. That versus customer complaints. Why do you think that complaints are more important?
It's interesting because we think of focus groups, voice of the customer at the front end of the process, where people are telling us what we'd like a product to be like, the features we'd like to see, but it's a little bit vague. There's still a lot of shades of gray. But we don't use voice of the customer when we talk about complaints. We often think of them, unfortunately, as complainers, and that this is a burden that we have to deal with this information. In fact, that voice that's speaking to us, that customer that says, listen to me, there's something wrong with your product, it can be features that were just overlooked for a large segment of the people who use our products. And again, these products, I'm in the medical device business, but the thing that's amazing about this area is that it works. If you do it well, it works whether you're making bronchoscopes or batteries, cookies or cars. It doesn't matter. We all know how we feel when our voice isn't heard, if we filed a complaint, if we've given a recommendation for an improvement and nothing happens. We just think nobody's listening. On the FDA part of the world and also internationally, there's this concept of design validation, and it's testing products in the manner in which they will be used. But even when a company is doing it, unless they've done a huge clinical trial, you don't really start to see how the product is performing. And one of the things I'll be talking about, in my experience, if I look back over recalls that we had that were particularly painful in any company, we look back and we say, if we had looked at that sentinel event, that first one or two complaints where we said, oh no, it's user error, they just don't know how to use our device, or it was a one-off, it was a simple malfunction, or it broke and shipped in transit. If we had drilled down, I can think of examples where we would have shut down the production line, we would have really reduced the damage by not continuing to ship product to the field for months, and then all of a sudden the weight of the malfunctions we were seeing, or worse, if there were occasional minor injuries, we would have to bring the product back. And in this talk, when I'm talking about reducing risk in 6 different ways, yes, the key is reducing the risk of harm to patients and the users of products. And again, it doesn't have to be medical devices. But there's also that loss of business share. I know that companies, if somebody has a recall, they pull the product off the market. Other companies want to swoop in, grab that market share, restore customer confidence. So we'll talk about 6 things. And one of the things too, I joined a company where there have been a number of recalls, and actually it wore the employees down, and it can actually affect the risk of losing good employees who say, I can't do this anymore. All I'm doing are root cause analyses for recalls. So I want to take this talk away from the focus of compliance and paperwork. I'll talk about Kaizen events that we did and some of the findings and some of the other tips and tricks that got our cycle times down to less than 30 days for even the most complex devices.
Well, now, Richard, this seems so logical. I mean, obviously, you talk about voice of the customer. Oh, everybody wants to use voice of the customer information. They want to use it to improve their company. So, what would be holding a company back from excelling or at least making good use of these types of complaints?
Well, I'll tell you one thing. Sometimes when I've given a talk on CAPA, I've said, why is it that CAPA is a 4-letter word? Companies that do the thing with CAPA is that it's not in anyone's job description unless you have an enlightened company. I'll tell you something we did, and I'll talk about it more during the talk, but we actually created a group of engineers, talented, some of them with Six Sigma black belt training. All they did was improvement. But it was CAPA, but really it was a product improvement group, and they were recognized, and they were heroes inside the company, because what we did is we had a very rapid-fire way of taking complaint information into a root cause analysis, into a corrective action if it warranted that. But many companies have such a cumbersome CAPA system, they're trying to put too much into it rather than dealing with simple nonconformances, that they just simply do not have the bandwidth to take some of the really serious issues that they're seeing on complaints and getting into a rapid fix. And actually, I'll talk about some ways that we can do that.
Yeah, actually, that's a good lead into my next question here. Is, I realize that the kind of customer inputs or metrics you monitor, it will vary from company to company and probably really more industry to industry. But can you give us maybe some metrics that you think are really most likely critical to any company, no matter what their business is?
Well, this is, I'll give some examples, John, in the webinar, but, there are certain things like closure time. I've gone into companies, it was not unusual, I'd say, how many complaints do we have open? Oh, about 5,000, we lost count. And a lot of times, that issue of having an objective to drive the closure times down, and we'll talk about some ways to do that during the talk. The other thing is just the root causes, of course. You're trying to compile what the typical root causes are, kinds of problems that the people are seeing on a routine basis. We also look at the response time for different groups because we're looking to other organizations to help us identify what the failure modes are. So basically, it's a lot of it is just around timing and resources that are applied and the Pareto of the different kinds of complaints so that we can start to reduce the incidence of particular failure modes, and then all of that information can be fed back into the design team so that we can design out those weaknesses in the product.
Okay, Richard, in just the couple of minutes that we have left, and I know you're going to talk a lot more about this on the webinar next Tuesday, but can you just give us maybe an example of a strategy, of one strategy for effective complaint management?
Well, I'll talk about one that was in a company that was where we had a lot of electromechanical equipment, a huge installed base in the field. We had 1,000 service people. One thing we found is it was suicide to try to bring in every service report. I've seen companies do this, and then they overwhelm the complaint department by culling out all the issues that were returned products for service, maintenance, repair. We would track that for any nuggets of information, but the bottom line is we gave our service techs, we trained them and gave them handhelds, so if something was a complaint, they could push a button and all the information that was in the service record came right into the complaint department, already screened in the field. We had a tiger team, a group of co-located engineers, nurses, and complaint department people. And when a call came in, we had a way to take that call with a warm handoff so that if there was an injury, it went directly to the nurses. If the person had trouble with their equipment, there had been a malfunction, they needed to restart their MRI machine. That wasn't one of the products we made, but if we did, it went directly to the engineers. If it was just, hey, our package is open, or we had something else that was a minor failure, it could go directly to the complaint people. But those people could share information. They could go down to the lab and look at the equipment to see what was actually failing. So that's one of the things I'll talk about is co-location of some of the key stakeholders.
Okay, well, terrific. Well, Richard Raziel, Vice President, Medical Devices for TÜV Südamericas. We are doing a webinar with Richard Raziel next week on Tuesday, so be sure to join TÜV Südamerica and Quality Digest for the free webinar, Effective Strategies for Complaint Management, and that'll be next Tuesday, May 19th, 2015 at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. Be sure to join us there. And Richard, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much. I'll see you on Tuesday.
Okay, see you, Richard.
Thanks, Richard. Bye. Yeah, it can be a good one. And for all of you out there, in Richard's article is a link out to register for the webinar if you do want to check that one out. And also keep an eye on a finger on your email, whatever it is. But look at that to see.
Right, and I should point out this, and I think Richard mentioned it here. This isn't only for people who are FDA-regulated industries. What he's going to cover is much more broad-based. His background happens to be that, but whether you're in a regulated industry or not, this would be a good webinar for you. So
absolutely.
Sure.
If you have customers, it's going to be a good webinar for you to check out. Alrighty. Well, let's turn now to a feature that we ran this week called Pitfalls in Experimentation and Data Interpretation, Part 2, which ran in Wednesday's issue of Quality Digest Daily, and the author is Matt Treglia. We ran Part 1 last week, Dirk, you remember. All of you out there probably remember. There's Part 2, you can see right there. Part 1 ran last week in QDD, and Dirk, you covered it here on QDL last Friday. And Treglia in that piece used some historical examples to look at these kind of fallacies and pitfalls of data interpretation and data analysis. And in that case, it looked at things like the Chinese famine, I guess, in the 50s, and snake oil, and looked at these historical examples and saw how we were let down.
How data is either not used or misused.
Or misused in many cases, absolutely. So in this part, he continues that with the same theme in Part 2 of the series, and there'll be Part 3 coming up next week. But here in Part 2, he again uses some historical examples to again show the truths of experiments and how data are used, and as they say, they are often misused as well. So here in part 2, he talks about a couple of pitfalls and fallacies. The first is the idea that you need to make sure that your experiments are valid. You need to make sure that you're testing for something that's real and is really useful. And the second one is that the data is unbiased. You can't get a good result if your data going in is biased in one way or another. In most cases, you're not aware of what the bias may be. So we're going to look at what those are. So first things first. Okay, the first pitfall that he talks about here is the idea that you want to run a valid experiment that addresses the true nature of the system and gets to what the real issues are so you can really see what's going on. And in this case, he uses a couple of historical examples, as we mentioned. The first one is the rollout of the M16 rifle in Vietnam, and the second one was New Coke. We all remember New Coke. Well, looking at the M16 rifle, now the M16 was released during Vietnam, and it jammed a lot when it was actually used in the field. And that was a surprise to a lot of military planners because it had not jammed hardly at all during the testing phase, and they kind of scratch their heads and they're like, well, why is this? Well, as it turns out that during the testing phase of the M16, they used a low residue gunpowder, but when they actually got it out in the field, they used the old gunky regular gunpowder, which tended to jam, and tended to jam more in the M16 than in prior rifles, right? So yeah, they didn't have the true in the field information data that they used to really get a result that was accurate. Well, it wasn't that dissimilar actually when New Coke was rolled out a few decades ago. The New Coke, of course, performed great when you think about it and you look back. New Coke did great in taste tests, right? Pepsi generally does well in taste tests too versus Coke. Well, the idea for that is that people prefer sweet drinks in a little gulp, in a little 1 or 2 ounce gulp when you're doing a little shot of it. But when you drink a whole can, it turns out people generally like something a little tartar, a little more distinct than just that sweetness. So people did like New Coke in the testing, in the blind taste
because
tests.
those were just sips.
Little sips. They
Yeah.
liked it versus old Coke, but when it came to the drinking a whole can of it, they said, wow, stuff's way too sweet. Like many people think that Pepsi is too sweet, right? So they didn't test it again in what was a real world environment. Just like the M16, they didn't really look at how it's going to be used in the field. The experiment was set up in a way that really kind of biased it against what the real results would be. So the moral of that one is consider all the variables and look at how something's actually going to be used when you use it when you're setting up the tests. The second pitfall used here, turning back to bias, regards whether or not you are inadvertently, bringing in some predisposed ideas that are going to change the way that the data is interpreted, right? You think you're using an unbiased survey, but in many cases you're not. The survey set is biased in one way or another. And he looks at 2 very well-known presidential elections from the 20th century. The first one was the very famous 1948 election where, we've all seen that paper where Truman held up the Dewey beats Truman.
Dewey beats Truman, yeah.
Which was all over the place in those days. Everybody assumed that Truman was going to lose that election. There were a couple of reasons for that. One was that the polls were all done like months before. Like the polling stopped like 2 months before the election, so there was a lot of movement at the end. But what was more than that was what they called quota bias, or this idea that there would be quota sampling done, which they don't do anymore. So in other words, they had this stratified set of data, and that people could go out within that set and they could ask anybody they want in the polls. But people tend to go with what's easy. They tend to go with the same type of people many times.
Yeah, or people that are near them.
Near or close to them. It's a
they match the quota, but they're within what's convenient for them to talk to.
Within a neighborhood or within the same type of people. So you don't really get a very wide-ranging sample of people, and there's really not enough randomization is the problem. The second one, which I actually didn't know about, that one I knew about pretty well. The other one I didn't know about was in 1936, where the Literary Digest predicted that Alf Landon was going to beat Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1936 election. Well, actually, if you know the story on this one, FDR won it in one of the all-time great landslides of all time. But yet, the Literary Digest prediction, their poll, and this was a huge poll. They polled 10 million people. They got 2.4 million responses.
Huge number of responses.
And their responses showed them that Landon was going to win in a cakewalk. So when it turned out the other way, they're like, what happened here? How could we be wrong? Well, the reason they were wrong is because when you look at the lists that they selected, that 10 million and the 2.4 they got, they were composed of automobile owners, telephone owners, and those who subscribed to their magazine subscribers. Well, in 1936, most people couldn't afford a car. They couldn't afford a phone. They certainly weren't wasting their money on magazine subscriptions. They were trying to feed themselves.
So the people they were polling were people with money.
Which tend to be guess what? Then as of now, Republicans, right? I mean,
Right.
so those people responded that they were going to favor Alf Landon. So there was this idea that there was a convenience bias on that poll as well, because those people all were kind of predisposed to answer in the way in which you assumed they were going to.
Yeah. So large numbers don't necessarily mean a good sample.
They don't.
Yeah.
They don't. And what Treglia's point here is that polling, really good polling, is hard. If you go for the easy, the low-hanging fruit, it's generally probably going to be wrong. You're going to have a convenience bias work in there in some way, shape, or form. So in order to really get data that's going to help you, whether it's for political polling or testing a new product or just an industrial test, you probably have to work at it a little bit. You have to really work to look at all those different biases that may or may not creep in there and get a good sample set to get good information that you can use later.
Yeah, but this is the second part of Matt Treglia of the series. The third part, I believe, comes out next week.
Next week.
You should read all three. They're really interesting. It's interesting how he looks at history to look at examples of different ways that data has been misused or abused or not used at all. So.
And it's not intentional, you know.
No, yeah, very not intentional. No,
this is not intentional bias or problems that people creep into the testing, but it still affects the result very, very significantly.
All right. Well, once upon a time, in a land called Industrial Age, the leaders of organizations resided at the top of a hierarchy. Managers were in the middle, and workers were supervised. So writes Jessie Lynn Stoner in her column this week, The 9 Essential Leadership Strategies in the Age of Information. The kind of stratification that Stone describes may have worked 150 or 100 or even 50 years ago when companies were largely monolithic and centralized. But in today's information age, where companies and their supply chains are far-flung and connected by technology, the old management principles really don't work anymore. And in order to function properly and efficiently, and as well foster innovation and quick response, all levels of the organization have to be interconnected, de-siloed as it were. And for this you need leadership strategies for the information age. And Stoner lists 9. I want to run through all 9 in no particular order, but I will pay particular attention to a couple that I think are important. So, number 1. Paint a very clear picture of where the organization is going. Well, everyone has to be on board and understand where their company is going and their part in it. Number 2. Provide leadership no matter your level or your role. And regarding this one, Stoner writes, no matter what your official organizational title, supervisor, manager, administrator, whatever, if you're not leading, you're standing still, or worse, you're going in circles. Leadership must be emergent, allowed and supported to emerge as needed. And she mentions, she mentioned right there, supervisor, manager, administrator, but I would add that everyone at some point takes on or can take on a leadership role. And that means if a frontline employee sees a need, an improvement, and has ideas on how to implement it, she should be able to pursue it with support and mentoring from people who have leadership skills. Help her lead a team to implement an idea. This really ties into and supports another of Stoner's 9 leadership strategies. Number 3, develop leadership capacity. Part of that development is giving those who want to lead a chance to do it. Okay, number 4, connect vision and execution. Number 5, value and utilize diversity. Another good one. And I think this one is actually pretty underutilized. Stoner writes that effective problem solving depends on utilizing the perspectives that others bring because of their experience, their orientation, their gender, their nationality, and so forth. And if you think about it, back in the industrial age, you could almost exactly link a company's organizational chart to society's organizational chart. You know what I mean? Who were the CEOs? Well, they were largely those from the upper echelons of society. Who were the middle manager? Well, they were usually a bit further down socially. And who did the grunt work? Well, women, minorities of race or religion, the disenfranchised, or those on the fringes of society. And yet, all those people have a capability of contributing a unique and useful perspective to a company's products and services. So today, all companies should be actively using the diverse viewpoints, the diverse cultures, and the perspectives that are in their companies. And by the way, just as an aside, one of our columnists, Thomas Cutler, had 3 good interviews over the past couple months here with women in management to get their perspective on women's influence in the workplace, and I would read that if I were you. It's interesting.
Very good.
So this idea of valuing and utilizing diversity also ties in quite nicely to another of Stoner's strategies. Number 6, drive profits through principles and values. The more your organization is in tune with various perspectives via its own employee diversity, the more in tune it is with society and the world as a whole. And this leads to a higher awareness of the social and environmental impacts of your products and services across the supply chain. Okay, number 7, influence without authority. Both Stoner and Quality Digest columnist Jack Dunnigan have written about this. Those 3 words, I think, say it all. Influence without authority. You really want people to do something because they want to or see it as the right way and not just because you told them so. Okay. Number 8, collaboration across boundaries. Break down the silos. And finally, number 9, use technology to stay connected. Nothing will ever replace the value of face-to-face time, right, Stoner? But the reality is that most teams need to be able to work together over great physical distances. This connectedness, this communication is really what underpins the previous 8, I think. In today's far-flung supply chain and organizational structure, if you can't communicate vision, if you can't share ideas, if you can't mentor a potential leader, you're going to fail. And technology is a key component to making some of that communication happen. Yeah. So for more on this and of course all the other articles, the links are down below the player page. Click them and read to your heart's descent. By the way, you can also visit our mobile site if you m.qualitydigest.com if you're on a smart device, and that'll take you out to our mobile site.
That's right. Check that out too. You know, it was interesting, the 9 points that she raised there map back a lot of them pretty significantly to Deming's 14 points.
Interesting.
And
true.
If you look at it again and you look at some of the
Yeah.
language, it just came to me as you were reading them again. I thought, wow, there's a lot of these really do map back pretty well to what Deming was saying, 20, 30, 40 years ago. So
imagine that.
Imagine that. It's the wisdom never goes away.
Smart man.
That's right. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Richard Raziel, for joining us today. And all of you, be sure to check out the webinar that Richard and Dirk are going to be doing on Tuesday the 19th. Effective Strategies for Complaint Management. That's the webinar with Tu Sood and Quality Digest. Again, that is on May 19th, 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. And you can link out to it right below the player page and check out your email as well for a link to it as well. So that's our show. Dirk, thank you for being here.
Sure.
We appreciate that.
Yep.
All of you as well. Have a great weekend. We'll see you next week.
So long.
Bye.
Four, three, two, one, fire.